Welcome back. And I have the pleasure of introducing Jnanavaca. So I think many of you know Jnanavaca very well. Get me in order. Thank you. This is what I does. Yeah, some of you may not be familiar with Jnanavaca. So I thought what I'd do as a way into introducing Jnanavaca, I thought I'd ask the question, well, what is a president? Yeah, what is a president? So most of the Buddhist centers, Maitreyabandhu Buddhist centers across the world have a president. But what is a president? So, well, they're not like a head of state where they're in control of it. Have that responsibility.
No, I'm not. Thank you.
And neither are they that sort of the president where there's a head of, the ceremonial head of state who are wheeled out for the coronation. So it's not that kind of president. So it got me thinking, what is the president? What's that about? Well, I think it'd probably take quite a long time to go into all the details. But there were three particular things that came to mind. So I thought I'd just say a little bit about those in relation to Jnanavaca. So the first one that came to mind is the president. You could say the president is the guardian of the spiritual vision of the center. Yeah. The president just keeps an eye over, yes, in a way, what's essential really, what's really important. Why are we here? Why are we here? I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. So the second thing that came to mind is the president gives, Jnanavaca doesn't live here in Cambridge, so he has an outsider's perspective and he's able to sort of see things from a bit of a distance. Sometimes when you're involved in things, you can't see, we know that ourselves when we're up in front of something. So the president provides an outsider's perspective. But then the third thing that I think, in a way, possibly is the most important is, I think the president is a spiritual friend to the Sangha. So it's a spiritual friend to individuals in the Sangha, but also to the Sangha as a whole. And, well, there are many more, features of what it is to be a president, but for me these are very important, and I would say that Jnanavaca is very good at all of these. I think we're very fortunate to have Jnanavaca as our president, and as I say, for me, being a spiritual friend is both something in itself, but in the context in which everything else happens. And a good friend is someone who's very enjoyable to be with. It's very stimulating. They might be supportive of you. They help you to be heard, seen and heard. They might give advice, and occasionally they might need to admonish you. Yeah, that sometimes happens. But they're there for you. They're there when you're needed. And Jnanavaca as a good friend are all these things. I found that he's all these things. But more than that, yeah, he's not just a friend, he's been a spiritual friend to those of us who are running the centre and to our Sangha as a whole. He's a special friend, he's a spiritual friend. And he's a friend I found in that he holds, reveals and unfolds something of the spiritual vision that we're here for. Yeah, and that's in a way what he's doing tonight in giving a talk here. And I found he does that in a way that really connects with those who he's in contact with. He brings a sort of a deeper vision into light, and I have very much appreciated his clarity and his inspirational expositions of the Dharma. Yeah. Another good feature of a friend is that he relates to the best in you. Yeah, he relates to the highest in you. He relates to the potential in us, even if we can't quite see that potential ourselves. And again, I've experienced Jnanavaca do that. He's a very good friend in that way. Yeah, so I feel we're very fortunate to have Jnanavaca here. I've had the pleasure of knowing him, I think, almost a couple of decades now. Not as a close friend, but I've seen him. And the thing that really, well, there's several things that really strike me. He is a great exemplar of someone living the Dharma life. Yeah. Yeah, what I've seen is over the years that he consistently applies the Dharma to his life, and that's very impressive. And not only does he do that, but I've seen him change, and I've seen the Dharma influence and affect his life. And for me, that's given me a lot of confidence in my own practice on the efficacy of the Dharma. There's another aspect about Jnanavaca is that he seemed, from my angle, he seems to really enjoy his Dharma life. Yeah, his friendships, his communication, his study, his love of the arts. He really enjoys it, and that comes across. It's a lovely feature. I think one of the last things I want to mention is I personally find his presentation of the Dharma always very fresh and new. It has a sense of just being uncovered, of being discovered, of being revealed, and that's a great quality. I personally think it comes from his depth of reflection, study. But also, he doesn't just think on his own, he doesn't just reflect on his own, but he's really good at collaborating with others. Through your great friendship with Maitreyabandhu, and what comes out of that friendship. And also, it's just a delight to see with your during the Nature of Mind series, which is on YouTube. There are many interviews that he did with some very interesting people, but it feels like something comes out of the collaboration, for the sharing of ideas, and that's very rich, and it's a quality that you bring. So I could say more, but I'll leave it there. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say on this topic of opening up to the luminous mind.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Raja. Yeah, very good to be here again, and very nice to see all of you. Many familiar faces, as well as some new ones to me. So thank you for coming. And yes, in case I forget to say this, I'm giving another talk tomorrow night, and they're linked. I mean, it's a two-part talk, really. So even if this one doesn't quite hit the mark, come tomorrow, because it might. I wanted to begin with some thought that just occurred to me while we were meditating, which was that the Nobel Prize in 2022 for physics was awarded to three men called Alain Aspect, although that's probably not how he says it, John Clauser and Anton Zellinger. And they were awarded the prize last year, but it was for they're all three of them are experimental physicists. But the experiments that they did, I think some of them did them independently, but the experiments that they did were conducted several decades ago, I believe. What I'm not going to be able to go into the experiments themselves, nor try and explain the physics, not least because I don't think I understand it. But what they are said to have shown, and what they won the Nobel Prize for, is that they showed experimentally, not just theoretically, they showed experimentally that reality is not how we perceive it. They showed, more technically, that the assumption of local realism doesn't hold. And what that means is, local there refers to the notion that the world consists of separate objects in time and space, independent objects in time and space, separate independent objects. That the separate bit of that is that what's termed local, technically. Yeah? And realism is referring to the fact that these objects have existence in and of themselves. They're objective, they're out there, independent of our perceiving of them. They have objective existence. That's what realism means. And what they showed was that these two assumptions, if you add them together, they can be shown to be not true. The world does not consist of really existing, objective, independent, separate objects in time and space. Isn't that incredible that they've just shown that? Now, they showed that several decades ago. I think it was in the 80s. It's taken around 40 years for the Nobel Committee to recognize that this is earth-shattering. Yeah, and it's one thing to have theoretical physicists say, oh, the world is not objectively real and not, you know, it is interconnected, doesn't have separate objects. It's quite another to have experiments that prove that. The thing is that it took several decades for the Nobel Committee to realize that this is, you know, turns everything on its head, common sense on its head. And I think it will take, I don't know how many decades, maybe centuries, for this to filter down into sort of laymen and laywomen's consciousness. Unless we're Buddhists, because this is this should be part of the currency of our reflections, that reality is not as it appears to be. That should be part of how we, well, it should be one of the reflections that we're trying to take deeper and deeper into our own practice. For me, speaking personally, I as a young man, I kind of had an intuition. Maybe I'd read some things, maybe it was some sort of precocious intuition that reality was not what it appeared to be. And it led me to study physics. It led to, well, the trouble was, because I thought, oh, I'll learn about how things really are through studying physics. The trouble was, I wasn't very good at it. And I didn't realize that until I actually embarked on a course at university. At school, I'd sort of gotten away with it through memorizing things. At university, you have to actually understand them. And I realized that I wasn't very good at it. Either the theoretical or the experimental. I was worse, I think, well, I don't know what I was worse at, possibly the experimental. I'm very clumsy. I've learned to be a little bit more mindful as I've got older and practiced. But I can remember causing havoc in the labs. I can remember a bench full of all this equipment, and I was working with my tutorial partner, and we were both working on this experiment all day, trying to, I don't know what we were trying to do actually. And he just said, oh, I'm just going to the loo. And I thought I'd tidy the desk, which had tubes and apparatus and measuring equipment and so forth. One of the bits of apparatus was a mercury barometer that was measuring pressure. And it just seemed a bit untidy where it was with all. So I just tried to sort of tilt it into a more tidy position under some tubing. What I didn't sort of clock is that if you tilt a barometer that's open to it sort of the mercury anyway, it started to boil and filled the lab with mercury vapor, which meant that we had to evacuate. Everybody had to evacuate. And the whole lab, it was a large room, had to be dusted down with sulfur for, I don't know, for the rest of the day, for days. I wasn't very good at it. But what I'm glad now, at the time it was just embarrassing and humiliating to not be very good at it. I'm glad now that I wasn't very good at it, because had I been very good at it, maybe I would have stayed on and become an academic, a physicist. And what I realize now as a Dharma practitioner is that even people who win the Nobel Prize, like Alain Aspect, etc., it doesn't, they might discover mathematical and conceptual ways of understanding how things are, but it doesn't change necessarily their lives. Conceptual understanding doesn't do it on its own. That's not to say that conceptual understanding isn't important. Otherwise, why would we talk about the Dharma at all? So I'm going to be trying to look at how we tend to misinterpret our experience. And I'm going to use a Dharmic framework, not a physics one. You'll be relieved to know. The Dharmic framework, in fact, these two talks are based on some talks that Subhuti gave at the London Buddhist Centre 10 years ago in 2013. So if you want to go back to the original, I'm going to try and channel Subhuti, but I don't think I'm going to channel his clarity and articulateness. If you want to listen to the original, they're a set of rambles, as he called them, called Consciousness Unfolds, and they were given in 2013. But yes, I've based my stuff on those talks. Why this is important for us as practitioners, why it's important for human beings, this notion that we've got things wrong in our interpretation, that we don't see things as they really are, that reality is other than we normally experience. Why that's important, of course, is because what the Buddha said is that as a result of this spiritual ignorance, we suffer. We suffer. We cause ourselves unnecessary suffering, and we tend to cause others suffering too, at least if we act out of unawareness. So it goes right to the heart of what life is for. Not seeing how things are keeps us in this state of suffering. And I know most of you know that. It's just that I want to emphasize that, because I'm not going to be talking about dukkha, about suffering. I'm going to be talking more about how we've misinterpreted things. And if it starts to feel too technical or too academic, I just ask you to bear in mind it's not. It's of existential import. It's of the most important thing, because it's the key to freedom. It's the key to freedom. So I want to talk about consciousness, and I guess I have to say first off that one can't and shouldn't, in a way, talk about consciousness. As soon as you say the word consciousness, as soon as I say it, you haven't said it, as soon as I say the word consciousness, I'm giving the impression that consciousness is something that I can talk about, we can talk about, that it's a thing. And it's not. From a Dharmic perspective, consciousness is not a thing in this world of appearances. Consciousness is referring to that which knows things. It's the knowing quality, but it's not in this world of things. It's not said to be even in this world of time and space. So if it's not in the world of time and space and things, to give it a noun is to falsify what we're talking about. And yet, if we want to talk about our experience of being alive, and if we want to talk about where the root problem is in our misinterpretation of this experience of being alive, then we have to find a way of talking. So I'm going to talk about consciousness with this caveat that it's not a thing. And in a way, it's beyond grasp. It's not something that we can know in the sense that you can know a chair or even another person, in a sense. Consciousness is the knowing aspect, not the known. And yeah, I sort of just said that it's not really in time and space. At least there's an aspect of consciousness that is not in time and space at all. There's an aspect of it. And it's perhaps that aspect of it that we are trying to, as Buddhists, as practitioners, free up. We're trying to allow that aspect to, in a way, become part of our experience. Again, that's a concession to a way of talking. Because it's then that we can experience not just freedom, but all the qualities of the enlightened mind, the love, the peace, the sort of unshakable peace, the equanimity, the fearlessness that transcends the notion of death and all loss. It's then that energy is said to be liberated, that is normally tied up in our deluded, self-protecting way that we function, that I function. Energy is liberated, creativity is liberated. But more than that, from a Dharmic perspective, in a way we free ourselves from this round of birth and death, this samsaric round, and we deeply realize that we're not really separate, objectively existing things. That nothing is, and what's said to be released is compassion, is love, is a sense of solidarity with everything, a sense, I guess, of oneness. And if that is possible, and it's said to be possible for all human beings, then everything else that we, you, are trying to do with our lives, every other way of judging our lives pales, I think, by this quest for enlightenment. Maybe I'll come back to that. So sometimes I think we get a glimpse of this, of consciousness in a way that isn't yet tied up in this construct of a me in here being conscious of a world out there. Sometimes it sort of breaks free. It wants to break free, and sometimes it does. So sometimes when you wake up and you don't quite know where you are, or you haven't quite come to yet, there is awareness, but you haven't sort of started to label things. Yeah, so this morning I woke up in Artapriya's bed. He wasn't there. He wasn't there because he's away on retreat, and I'm in his room. And for a moment, I didn't know where I was and why I was where I was. And there's in a way, the normal mind, which tries to label, categorize, orientate in time and space, hadn't kicked in yet. So that's a little hint of consciousness in a mode that hasn't yet been caged by time and space and orientation in time and space. I'm not saying that that's what the enlightened mind is like, wondering where it's waking up. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that we get little hints that of just being aware without labels, and the enlightened mind would be able to not put labels on things. Sometimes, well, I don't know if you've ever passed out and come to. You can have that sort of sense. I had to have a procedure a few years ago where I was sedated And it's great being sedated, actually. And you come to, and you don't really know what's going on, but you're very happy. And again, I'm sure that's not what enlightened consciousness is like. But we do get moments of that. Perhaps more significantly, if you meditate and you have a particularly absorbed meditation, and then you open your eyes, and sometimes you start to, well, you look and you just see colors and shapes and forms, and it looks radiant, and you haven't started to sort of label things as flower or candle, or you haven't started to sort of try and construct a world out of those images. The first time I went on retreat, I mean, when newcomers come to the Dharma, remember your first retreat, if you've done many retreats, and you can have a sense of wonder opening up, just looking at things. I can remember looking at a sort of a stalk of grass. Well, it was a sort of long stalk, casting a shadow onto a stone floor, and just being amazed. And as the wind blew, the shadow moved as the stalk moved, and I was rapt for 10-15 minutes, and it was just a sense of wonder. Well, we have that if we practice those opening up experiences where words are inadequate to the experience. That can happen more and more. So why doesn't it happen more often? Why don't we live? Maybe you do, actually. Maybe you do have this expansive consciousness much of the time. For me, it comes and goes, and I don't live in it. Most of the time, I forget. And then, every so often, I'm reminded again that it's possible. So to talk about the nature of experience and why we've got it wrong, or how we've got it wrong, maybe, which is important if we're going to see things as they really are. To talk about that, I'm going to use a model from the Dharma that runs all the way through the Dharma. It's the model of the 5 skandhas. How many of you are familiar with the 5 skandhas as a model, as a construct? Yeah. So I've written up the Sanskrit terms here just because, I don't know, that might help. I haven't written up what they mean, so that might not help. But I'll talk you through what they mean, just because these are Sanskrit terms. And I should say that Bhante says that somewhere, I think he says that this model of the 5 skandhas is so important that you can hardly call yourself a Buddhist without being familiar with it. For many years, I kind of thought, I don't see why this is so important, this model. I think I'm beginning to appreciate it more. There's 5 skandhas, and skandha means heap or aggregate. Another way of talking about it is it means category. And these are 5 categories for dividing up our experience of this phenomenal world in time and space. There are 5 ways of dividing up our experience to analyze it a bit more closely. That's what is going on. And it's useful for reflection. I mean, it's useful for meditating on, to see if these categories are, well, whether they contain a real me or not, for example. It's useful for meditating upon. Okay, so these 5 heaps, categories, grouping, aggregate, what they're called. You may or may not be able to see that. I don't know where If you're sitting at the back, you may not be able to see it, but don't worry if you can't. Come and have a look later. I'll go through it. And this model, I think, well, the way Subhuti's explained it helps to explain what's going on in our experiential situation from a particular perspective. So the first category, the first skanda, is rupa. So would anybody like to say what rupa is? I mean, don't guess, but somebody who, yeah, who said that? A few people said form. Yeah, form. What do we mean by form? Physical objects, yeah. Material world, yeah. Earth element, yeah.
Representation.
Oh, what makes you say that?
I don't really know what it means, but we have Buddha rupas out there that represent the Buddha.
Ah, yes. Yeah. So we've had the material world, objects, the earth element, representation. All of that's kind of true, actually. It's all kind of true. But the key thing here to realize is, well, one way of talking about rupa is its image. It's one translation that might be quite helpful is images. Images that present themselves, not just visual images to the eye, but also images that present themselves to the other senses. I know image tends to imply a visual thing, but imagine that it applies to the other senses. And representation is a good word as well. It's how the world appears to us through the senses. The reason that I'm saying things in a bit of an obscure way is that Buddhism is agnostic about whether the world is out there independently of our perception of it. And if it is out there independently of our perception of it, what it's like. So rupa refers to our perception of the world through the senses. And it's the thing that we tend to assume is out there. So when I look out, like right now, I'm seeing all of you, and you're all looking and you're seeing me. And I tend to assume you're out there and existing just as you appear, and you will do the same for me, probably. But actually, what we've got is appearances through the eyes and through our consciousness, through our eye consciousness. We don't really know what's out there. If you could see radio waves, if our eyes were able to see frequencies other than what we call the visible spectrum, if we could see radio waves, or if we could see infrared light, or if we could see, I don't know, mobile phone signals or whatever it is, then I don't know, the world would appear differently. Yeah, it would appear very differently. So rupa is what we think of as the most objective part of experience. But it is an appearance to the senses, rather than, there isn't this assumption in Buddhism that things are as they appear. And in a way, how could they be? Maybe I won't go into that too much. Anyway, rupa is the most objective, as it were, part of the experiential situation. Image is a good word for it. Representation is a good word for it. And this, you could talk about sounds as they are represented to our sense of hearing. And again, we know that there are frequencies of sound that we don't pick up, that our ears don't pick up. If we were a bat, the world would be heard and even seen differently. Yeah. So the world as it appears to us appears through our senses. If we had different senses and different consciousnesses, we would experience the world differently. And in a sense, who's to say which is more true, our world or the bat's world? So Rupa is appearances as they appear to us. So far, well, we've already started to go into waters which hint at how we tend to misinterpret the world, because we don't normally go around thinking, oh yes, the red bus is I'm only seeing red because that's the frequency that my eyes pick up, and that's the experience that I have of that frequency of light. We don't think like that. We just say it is red. Yeah. So we're starting to already see how we live in an interpreted world, not necessarily a world as it actually is. It's interpreted partly through the sorts of senses that we have, through the body that we have. Like touch, we think that when we touch something, like I've picked up a cup and it's solid and it's holding water, but in a way, nothing is solid. A physicist would tell you that nothing is solid. And it's only because of particular electromagnetic repulsion from the hand, my hand, and the cup, that my hand isn't going through the cup. So again, our senses are picking up and interpreting the world in a certain way, experiencing it in a certain way. That's Rupa. Then there's Vedana. So Vedana, anybody? Pain. Well, it can be pain. I mean, it can be painful, but that's not the definition of Vedana. Feeling. So every Rupa impact, Vedana is the impact of Rupa on us. The impact of Rupa on us. Every time Rupa impinges upon, well, Rupa is part of the experience, but it impinges on us and causes feeling. Feeling in the sense of just sensation. And you know, Buddhism categorizes pleasant, painful, and neutral sensations. Every sense contact that we have has some sort of impact, and Vedana is that impact. It's either pleasant or painful or neutral to varying degrees, pleasant or painful. Yeah. So Vedana is the impact of Rupa on our experience, I guess. Yeah. And then Samnya.
Perception.
Perception and recognition, yes, and interpretation. So it's all of those things. It's perception, recognition, and interpretation. Remember, this is just a model. And if you, I don't know, I mean, the Abhidharma did analyze these down further and further and further. I think that's a sort of, you get diminishing returns. So I don't think we need to be too exact to try, well, I don't want to be too exact, to try and get to the point of why this model is helpful. So Samnya is translated normally as perception, and it's recognition, and it's interpretation as well. So when you see visual objects are perhaps easiest to talk about. When we see something, what we tend to very quickly, what our minds quickly do is categorize it and say, oh yes, it's one of those. I recognize one of those. That's a chair, or that's a tree, or that's a dog. And that categorization is very, very helpful from a survival perspective, because if you didn't recognize a chair from, I don't know, tiger, you'd be in trouble. You wouldn't survive very long. So the mind quickly has to interpret, it perceives, it recognizes, it interprets what appears to it. Yeah, and animals do this. It's not just that humans do it. A giraffe will be doing it. But humans have language, which a giraffe doesn't, or not very much of one. And language gives us a great deal more sophistication in how we might categorize and interpret the rupa. Yeah, a huge deal more sophistication, and our interpretations can become very complex indeed. But sometimes I mean, normally this happens so quickly, the mind sees something and it's already categorized it, that we don't sort of see this as a process that's actually going on in time. But sometimes when you encounter something unfamiliar, for a moment you're thrown. And it's like, oh, Samnya hasn't quite worked. I can remember being on a solitary retreat, a long solitary retreat, and I was in Guijueloca, in the men's retreat center in southern Spain in the mountains, and I'm sort of doing some walking meditation up a sort of quite a narrow track with a drop. Anyway, so I'm trying to mindfully walk. I'm also trying to not step on the ants that are doing their very important activity of going from A to B. And then suddenly, so I've been meditating on my own for several months, and then I look up and there are these people in my way. You know, about as far as Padapuri or Bayamati are sitting from me. And I'm completely startled because this was my private land. There was a gate barring, as it were, people, telling them to keep out. I hadn't seen people so close to where I was living. I don't know, I had a mixture of emotions of kind of startled, fear, anxiety, a certain sense of what's going on. And it took a few seconds to realize that they were mountain goats. They were goats. They were ibex. They weren't people. They were very different from people. They had horns and 4 legs. And it wasn't that I'd been smoking something. I'd been meditating and was hopefully more aware. But what had happened was that these ibex, they're not that familiar to me in Bethnal Green in London. So they're not, you know, they're not part of my sort of mental furniture, filing cabinet. And also neither in that stage were people, as it were. You know, they weren't meant to be there. So it was like, and because I'd been meditating, I think my consciousness was a bit more open and not in this labeling mode. It was quite open to whatever perceptions arose. And I was enjoying that sort of mode as much as I was able to rest in it. And then suddenly I'm confronted with some rupa, and I can't place it. And I look for the closest category that I have to living beings, and that's people. And you can just see how, well, I could see then, the mind is, that Samnya is an actual process, and sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes it doesn't work. So actually, I'm going to keep coming back to Samnya, because Samnya is where from this model's perspective, where the problem lies and where we need to work, But I want to run through the other two and then come back to Samnya. So sanskara, what's sanskara? Habits, who said that? Yeah, habits, yeah.
Tendencies.
Tendencies, yeah.
Mental forms.
Mental formations, yeah. It's they're volitional responses, and they can become habitual. We're creatures of willing. Mind is, Asanga said that mind is always hungry for experience. And we are always sort of moving in towards or away from, or at least most of the time, we're desiring or pushing away. We're desiring creatures. We're always grasping or moving away from. And sanskara is the way that we well, that's I mean, another way of talking about it is karma. It's volitional actions of body, speech, and mind. Yeah. And you can, they can become habitual. Okay, and then vijnana. Science, no, I wouldn't say it's science. Consciousness. Yeah, so vijnana is normally translated as consciousness. Normally it's the consciousness that is divided consciousness, that sees things in terms of a me in here and a world out there. It is divided into a subjective and an object, into a grasper and a grasped. So vijnana is that. It's consciousness which, in a way, creates a sense of a coherent world, a sense of a coherent me in a world. Because without that, we would just be getting sense impressions. We'd be seeing colors and hearing sounds and having physical sensations and so forth, taste and smell, and some mental images as well, but they wouldn't all add up into a coherent world. Whereas, you know, I can look over there and see some yellow, and then turn over there and see you, and it all is of a coherent world. Yeah, I guess young babies may not have learned to do this yet, and they all, you know, every sensation, it's not all very joined up for them, is it? I've got a little great nephew, and he's only 2. He is now living in a more coherent world, but it wasn't that long ago when he couldn't sort of piece together everything. So vijnana is consciousness, and it's doing that. So why is this model helpful? Because what it's saying is, I'm going to go back to Samnya, perception, recognition, interpretation. And what this model is saying is that that's where we go wrong. It's Samnya which misinterprets experience and doesn't interpret it in a way that is in accordance with how things really are, and that keeps our consciousness small. It keeps it caged in a constructed world. The world that Samnya constructs, what it does is, it takes the rupa and says, that's out there as a independently existing objective object, objectively existing independent object. So it turns rupa into an object rather than seeing it as part of an image in experience. It turns it into an object, independently existing, independent of the experiential situation. And then it takes Vijnana and says, oh, that's me. That's me. And I also exist independently and somehow in a fixed way. Vijnana in this model is said to be momentary, for example. It's said to arise moment to moment with every new experience. It arises fresh, according to this model. But what we do, Samya does, is it takes Vijnana, it doesn't see it as moment to moment fresh. It says, oh, this is me, and I'm a fixed entity somewhere in here or in here. And Rupa is independent of me and existing out there. Yeah. To go back to the Nobel Prize winners, one way of thinking about this is that their experiments were showing that it's not like that. Things don't have independent objective existence. So Samya keeps getting it wrong. If we can understand that, we can start to see how we might undo this misinterpretation. And in a certain sense, that is what all of the Dharma is pointing to. The whole of the Dharma, every part of it, is pointing to how do we undo this misinterpretation. Because if we can undo that misinterpretation, and to the extent that we can, something else happens. And Vijnana is freed from this kind of prison of me in here with the world out there. It's freed. It starts to we start to experience our experience as like an unbounded field of awareness that doesn't have a center to it, that is unbounded and, well, limitless. On another solitary retreat, I was recently on a solitary retreat at Vajrasana, and well, it's a few years ago, a couple of years ago now, and I was trying to reflect on this sort of stuff and meditate on it, and I can remember just going for a walk, and particularly when we're out walking, I think it's quite useful to see if you can remember this. See if you can remember that the tree that you're seeing, the car that you're seeing, everything that's appearing in your visual field, try and remember that it's an image, that the assumption that it's existing independently of your seeing it is just that, it's an assumption. And actually it's a misinterpretation. So I find that quite helpful when I'm walking, to see that, oh, that's what I'm doing. I'm trying to, I don't have to fix the thing as out there. If you can do that, you start to experience something a bit weird. What happens is that consciousness or awareness, you start to lose the boundary between in here and out there. It no longer is obvious what's out there and what's in here. You have a thought, and we normally assume that that thought's happening somewhere in here. You see a tree, and you're normally it's assuming that the tree's out there, but actually it's all happening in awareness. And on this retreat, I was out walking just around the field, and it was a beautiful late afternoon, beautiful winter afternoon, and the sun was setting to, well, one side as I was walking to my sort of left, it was setting, and I just kind of paused and was caught in the beauty of the sunset, and that was lovely. And then I turned around, and what I hadn't anticipated, what I hadn't expected, what I didn't realize was there, was that the full moon was rising directly opposite where the sun was setting. And it was so, as it were, breathtaking, unexpected, beautiful. I was shaken out of knowing what was going on. For a while, and it lasted quite a while, there was just awareness without this categorizing, and without a sense that, oh, I'm in here and the world is out there. And I can remember just bursting out laughing, because how silly of me, in all of this experience, it was all experience, the sun, the moon, the trees, the field, this body, how silly of me to just identify with this narrow bit of it and say, this is me, the rest isn't me. How silly, how arbitrary even. And for a moment I thought, could I be the moon? And for a moment that made sense as a question. I could be the moon. I could be everything if I wanted to be, because it was all happening in the same field of awareness, and there was no need to say me in here, bounded by this skin, and moon out there. How arbitrary and how silly. And what happened was just this release of joy and laughter and beauty. Everything is beautiful. Everything, not just the beautiful sunset and the beautiful moon. Life was wondrous, is wondrous, ungraspable, magnificent, and majestic somehow. Everything has a sacredness to it. I know that's easy on a solitary retreat. I'm not able to do that usually in Bethnal Green when I'm on my way to the co-op or something. It's hard to see everything as sacred much of the time when we're in this utilitarian mode. And our task as Dharma practitioners is to be able to do both. What I mean is be able to go to the co-op and get our food and allow this, this process of the skandhas to keep doing its thing. It's important when you're crossing the road to have a sense of me in here and the bus out there. It is, from an evolutionary perspective, do you see how important our unenlightened consciousness is from a survival perspective? But evolution wasn't bothered about, or the lower evolution, as Bhante calls it, isn't bothered about waking us up and showing us how reality really is. It's mainly just bothered about keeping this organism alive until it can procreate and probably pass on its genes. So our task is to be able to sort of function in an ordinary way, have a cup of tea, make breakfast, go shopping, at the same time to be aware, that we are living in an interpreted world, that is an interpretation. It's not how things really are. It's not how things really are. If we can do the both, then it's as if enlightened consciousness shines through this world where we can still function as if we're in time and space and moving in the world of objects. But something shines through that illumines and elevates our experience so that it feels sacred, so that being alive, having consciousness at all, having senses at all, having sensations at all, is somehow enough. It's sacred. And do you see if we could live like that, if experience itself was enough, if consciousness was freed from the tyranny of this construct, we wouldn't go chasing after particular contents of our experience. I go chasing after external things that I think are external to me in order to fulfill. Yeah. I found myself buying a new backpack bag. I have some sort of rationale for why I need one, but I don't need one. I found myself buying it because a friend of mine has one, Maitreyabandhu, and I kind of wanted what he had. And it's as childish as that. I could be 6. Do you know what I mean? I'm 56. No, I'm not. I'm 57. And but I could dress it up, and you know, and it's arrived. I bought it online, and it's arrived a few days ago. I've got it with me. I'm very pleased with it. But if I was living in this way, if I was living in this world where everything was sacred, where consciousness was freed, there would just be fulfillment in being aware. There would be no need to try and supplement it with grasping after things. That grasping after things, it's relatively innocent in buying a new little backpack. But that tendency to grasp and live as if external things and external people other than us are going to make us happy. And of course, what happens is that the construct breaks down anyway. Even if we try and maintain it and think, okay, well, we'll live in this misinterpretation. It breaks down. Why? Because things are impermanent. The bag breaks. And more tragically, people leave or die. So that construct that Rupa is an objective reality out there, it breaks down in those times. Sometimes more positively, consciousness opens up. And yes, we find that ourselves, as it were, breaking free of this cage, particularly if we're practicing. Actually, it can happen any moment, even if we're not practicing. It's like consciousness, and remember, I shouldn't be talking about consciousness, but it's as if it wants to break out and doesn't want to be in this confined little me. And separate from the rest of the world, from the rest of the cosmos. It wants to break out because the reality is that we're not separate, So it will sometimes break out. But if we're not familiar with Dharma practice, we'll shrink it back. Even if we are familiar, it's hard not to shrink it back. And also, if we're not familiar with Dharma practice, well, potentially it can be very destabilizing. So it's said that at death, at the death of the body, at the moment of death, the construct breaks down. All this construction breaks down, the body breaks down, and consciousness is freed. It's completely freed. And it's said that unless we are used to, familiar with what that experience of freed consciousness is, we won't be able to handle it. We won't be able to handle it. We'll shrink back from the enormity of it. We'll shrink back out of fear. We won't even, it'll be instinct. It won't even be a conscious choice. We'll shrink back. And it's said that eventually, you know, in the bardo, we shrink back and we find another familiar form in a familiar world. And we carry on the whole process again of trying to be fulfilled and finding that something just doesn't work. It never quite works. No matter how many things you buy, it never quite fulfills. And we do that again and again and again. So the whole of our Dharma life is an attempt to allow this to vijnana to break through into unbounded consciousness, into jnana, and to be able to live with the constructed world as well, not to just, as it were, swoon at the enormity of the magnificence of consciousness, but to be able to live in this constructed world, knowing that it's a constructed world. And if we could do that, something would shine through, and it would be of the nature of love. It would be the nature of beauty. It would be the nature of meaning, of something sacred. And tomorrow I want to talk more about what that might look like. So come back for more. Thank you.